Jonathan Pierce stood motionless in the doorway, the city's late afternoon light cutting through the drapes and falling across a scene that was at once ordinary and impossible. Two little figures in plastic white coats huddled on a mattress on the floor, their faces intent, their voices clear and small as they administered tiny imaginary syringes. On the mattress, pretending to be ill, lay a woman with a tired smile, hair tucked in a scarf, hands folded on her chest, breathing softly as if pretending to sleep. "Mom, you have to take your medicine," one of the girls said in a thin, precise voice. "If you don't, you won't get better," the other added, solemn as a judge. Jonathan felt his legs give way before he could move. His hands clamped to the doorframe as tears burst from him uncontrollably. For 6 months his daughters had been locked in a silence that had hollowed the house and him. For 6 months he had paid for every conceivable remedy, expensive specialists, experimental therapy, machines that whirred and blinked, only to wake each morning to the sound of nothing. And now, there on a mattress in his study, his little girl spoke, called a stranger Mom, and his entire world rearranged in one small, shattering moment. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in people who still step up when the world turns away, take a moment to like, comment, and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to see will restore your faith in humanity. We'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below with your country and region, and let us celebrate the kindness that connects us all. Now, let's begin. If you had asked Jonathan Pierce a year earlier what the most precious sound in the world was, he would have said without hesitation, his wife Claire's laugh. That sound threaded through their brownstone on West 86th Street like a golden ribbon, bubbly and bright, infusing the rooms where homework was done, pancakes were burnt, and bedtime stories were told. Claire had been the center of their domestic universe, a teacher with a book always in her purse, a mother who hummed as she folded laundry, a woman whose arms smelled like lavender and who could make even the most ordinary afternoon feel like a small, brilliant holiday. Then, in the clean, clinical hours between midnight and dawn, Claire was gone. A sudden fever, a cascade of complications, an emergency no one had been able to stop. The doctors in the hospital wore their professional pity like a thin cloak. They said things like unexpected and rare, and we did everything we could. The world that had been Jonathan's life cracked open, and he fell into the fissure. Sophie and Emma, identical in the way that twins can be, down to the soft curl at the left ear, became still. In the weeks after Claire's death, they ate without appetite, slept like statues, and then stopped speaking entirely. The silence settled in the house like a new heavy furniture piece. It took up space at the table and in the beds and at Jonathan's side at night. He spent nights at the girls' doorway, watching their faces as if he might coax a syllable out of their lips by sheer force of will. For all his money, companies, holdings, philanthropic boards, nothing could buy back the sound of Claire's voice, and nothing could force his daughters to talk. Desperation is a currency that men like Jonathan know how to spend. He flew from business meeting to business meeting and, between calls, flew to specialists, child psychiatrists, neurologists, the most lauded pediatric trauma teams in the country. He installed sensory rooms in the house, imported music therapy equipment, and turned bedrooms into clinical sanctuaries. People came and went. Therapists with degrees as long as their resumes, clinical teams who promised progress. One of them, a famous neurologist and clinician from a renowned Manhattan medical center named Dr. Evelyn Hart, seemed particularly earnest. Dr. Hart's voice was reassuring and practiced. She told Jonathan that his daughter's silence was a severe form of mutism, brought on by profound trauma, and that in some, tragically, it could become chronic. Permanent, Dr. Hart said once in Jonathan's office, a cool hand on his forearm. "We must prepare for the possibility. But we will do everything." Her office smelled faintly of antiseptic and power. She had the authority of someone who had built an empire on a small private clinic attached to a major hospital. Jonathan believed Dr. Hart. He had to. Belief was everything now. For 6 grueling months the house filled with devices and people. Therapies were arranged around the clock. Jonathan paid with an almost holy abandon. Private consultations, overseas specialists flown in, experimental programs that were expensive because they were exclusive. But the girls did not speak. The Pierce home, once warm with the everyday noise of family life, had become a silent gallery. Jonathan moved through it like a ghost. Then, 6 months after Claire's death, he found himself needing help of a different sort. The house, grand, stately, and wholly unpractical, required hands to keep it running. The existing staff was exhausted. The household manager was managing more than he was meant to. Jonathan's own world was raw and inexperienced in the practicalities of a suddenly single father slumped under the weight of grief. He needed someone to clean the house and organize the rooms where the machines hummed, someone to make the small domestic things less heavy. That is how Maria Alvarez came into their lives. Maria was 30. She came up the brownstone steps with a canvas tote and a quiet air that seemed to carry entire stories in its folds. Her resume said only that she had experience in private homes. But her eyes, soft, dark, rimmed with the shadows of nights spent awake, told a different history. She spoke little during the interview. Jonathan, used to people speaking in elevator pitches, found her silence bracing. He hired her for practical reasons. Someone reliable, someone who could be entrusted with a busy, grief-stricken household. What Maria did not include on her resume, and what Jonathan did not ask, was that until 2 years earlier she had been a promising nurse at one of New York's busiest hospitals. She had worn scrubs into the night, stayed for extra shifts when emergencies outnumbered staff, and had a gentle competence with frightened parents and fragile patients. Then, in a single, catastrophically public complaint, her career unraveled. A patient's death was pinned on her by an internal review led by a senior physician whose signature carried influence, Dr. Evelyn Hart. It had been, Maria would later tell anyone who would listen, a miscarriage of justice. The patient had arrived already in a desperate state. Protocols had been muddied by the rush and confusion of an overburdened emergency department. But the official report, cold and decisive, named Maria's negligence as the cause. Her nursing license was revoked. Her references were erased with a signature and a sentence. A promising path was closed. She lost her job, her apartment for a time, the professional identity that had been the core of herself. Most painfully, she lost the respect of colleagues who had turned away. Maria did not tell this story when she came to the Pierce house. She walked its hallways with a broom and a cloth and an instinct for how dust gathered in the corners and how light pooled on the windowsill. She noticed the girls the first morning, 2 small pale faces at the window, their hands entwined, watching the street with a look she knew too well, a look like waiting for someone who would not return. They were silent. They had been that way so long that her chest hurt to see it. Without thinking, she began to sing as she folded the laundry, an old lullaby her grandmother had sung in Spanish. Her voice was not trained, but it was honest. Sophie turned her head first. Emma followed. Step by slow step, the 2 girls left the window and came to the kitchen where Maria hummed and lined forks and plates with ceremony. They watched her with a focus no amount of money had produced in their therapy sessions. Maria instinctively began to create small rituals. Songs while she tidied, stories aloud when she made the beds, imaginary conversations she held as she dusted the bookshelves. She pretended to have humorous arguments with herself over which soup to make, and the girls, their faces brightening like flowers toward sun, put their fingers into the flour and laughed without sound. In the days that followed, something slowly reshaped in the house. Sophie and Emma shadowed Maria like twin shadows. They would appear beside her in the kitchen, set out 2 toy cups with a solemnity that made Maria weep into the dish towel once when she thought no one was watching. She never used force. She simply stayed, a presence that did not demand, did not probe, did not professionalize grief. She offered the one thing their expensive machines and specialists had not, constant, ordinary companionship. Jonathan noticed, of course. He began to come home earlier and earlier, fingers fidgeting with his tie as he listened from the hallway. He had paid thousands for treatments that yielded no laughter, no words. Yet here were his daughters, silent still in the clinical sense, but visibly warming. One afternoon he came home and found them in the study. Maria lay on a mattress on the floor, eyes closed, the girls hovering like small doctors around her. He froze in the doorway. "Mom, you must take your medicine," Sophie said, with a thin, crystalline clarity that made Jonathan think he might be dreaming. "It will help you get better." Emma nodded, solemn. It was the first time Sophie and Emma had spoken since Claire's death. Jonathan crumpled then and there. He entered the room and collapsed against the doorframe, shoulders shaking with a grief and a joy so close they tasted the same. Maria opened her eyes in panic and sat up, cheeks flushing, trying to explain. "Mr. Pierce, I didn't mean to," she began. But Jonathan could not hear her words for the sound of his girls repeating things that had seemed buried under months of an empty house. He gathered them into his arms, and for a while the three were a tangle of sobs and laughter and incredulous kisses. He called Dr. Hart that night, eager to share the miracle. He expected congratulations or at least the professional warmth of someone who had dedicated her life to helping suffering families. Instead, Dr. Hart sounded flat, controlled. "This is concerning," she said. "They are calling a domestic employee mom. That can indicate an insecure attachment. It can mean confusion and a troubling dependence. We need to investigate who this woman is. Please, have you verified her background?" The word sat in Jonathan's chest like a splinter. He had invited professionals into his life with little resistance. Now a professional questioned the woman who had become the axis of his daughter's day. Dr. Hart offered to look into Maria's background herself as a precaution. Jonathan, who had never been comfortable with the way power operated behind the scenes, was wary but willing. He wanted the best for his daughters. Who would have guessed that the same person whose verdict had once broken a young nurse's life would be the instrument of suspicion now? It did not take long for Dr. Hart's reach to find Maria's past. She called Jonathan within days. "Mr. Pierce, there are serious concerns," she said. "This woman was a nurse, yes, but she was disciplined. The hospital record," her voice hardened. "She lost her license after a negligence finding. If she's posing as a clinician in your home, that's dangerous. You must remove her." Jonathan confronted Maria that night. Under the yellow lamp in the kitchen, she stood with her hands clenched around the strap of her tote as if it were an anchor. She did not deny that she had been a nurse. "Yes," she said softly. I lost my license. But Mr. Pierce," her voice trembled, "I did not hurt anyone. I did what I could. Dr. Hart," she ruled against me. "You lied on your application," Jonathan said before he could stop himself. The words spilled out hard. "You didn't tell me about your license. How many lies are there, Maria? How can I trust you in this house? With my children?" Maria's hands slid from the tote to the counter. Tears shone on her lashes, but she did not beg. She had something like pride left. "I needed work," she said. "No one would hire me with my license gone. I did not want to lie. I needed to survive. I chose this work because I love children. I never meant to deceive you." Jonathan, exhausted and tender and furious in ways he had not known were possible, told her to leave. He could hear Dr. Hart's voice in his ear, the expert suggestion of danger, the legalistic worry. Maria packed what little she had in a canvas bag and walked into the February night, head bowed. Sophie and Emma watched from the stair landing, their small bodies silhouettes against the dim hall. When she crossed the stoop, the sound of the closing door felt like an amputation. For a time after, the house returned to its clinical silence. The girls retreated again into the cocoon of not speaking. They stopped eating and stopped laughing. At night their bedrooms were cliffs. Jonathan stood on the edge wondering why he had allowed the one woman who had brought a sliver of light into their lives to be chased away because of a rumor, an accusation, history. Then, rummaging through a locked drawer in his study, a small, foolish habit he had developed when he needed the illusion of control, Jonathan found a file. It was an old report, dated 6 months before, written by a Dr. Michael Reed, a pediatric specialist at a clinic in Boston. He had a meeting scheduled with Dr. Reed back then, a consultation that should have been delivered to Jonathan, but the envelope had a different stamp. It had been addressed to Dr. Evelyn Hart. He sat down hard and read. The report was clinical and brief, but the language in it was a hammer. It said the girls exhibited an acute emotional trauma with sensory processing disturbances and a diagnosis of selective mutism, an intense anxiety-based condition that, given proper emotional intervention and stable caregiving, had an excellent prognosis. Expect full recovery of speech within 3 to 6 months, Dr. Reed wrote. Treatment: presence, music therapy, gentle sensory stimulation, and continuous effective caregiving. Avoid heavy medication and invasive procedures unless medically necessary. Jonathan's chest went cold. He called Dr. Reed immediately. It was Dr. Reed who, with a patient voice, said what his eyes had already told him. "I sent the report to Dr. Hart as requested. I assumed she would contact you and coordinate. She told us she would deliver the findings." Jonathan realized, like a man waking up from being drugged, that the more aggressive treatments and the expensive, intrusive therapies had come at the direction or with the endorsement of Dr. Hart. Why had he been led down a path of machines and medicine instead of the simple human therapy Dr. Reed recommended? The answer settled in like a stone. He hired private investigators and forensic auditors. He dug into billing records, clinic directives, and the web of relationships Dr. Hart had woven. What they found was worse than he had imagined. Dr. Hart had been generating lucrative treatment plans and labeling certain cases as chronic when they were not. She had steered patients into expensive experimental programs at her clinic. Programs that fed research grants, industry partnerships, and a closed ecosystem of referrals. Reports were changed, emails edited, and paperwork misdirected. In at least one case, a negative professional finding, an internal memo that could have exonerated a nurse, had been signed by Dr. Hart's office and then buried. When Jonathan confronted Dr. Hart, the cooling professionalism in her eyes did not falter. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "I was trying to protect your children. Reassure yourself, the protocols I followed were standard in severe cases." "You hit a report that said the girls would likely recover," Jonathan said. "You pushed treatments they didn't need and earned millions. You sent Maria away. You broke a woman's life." She did not deny the money. She did not deny the privilege. She denied nothing and everything at once, professional equivocation with a practiced smile. Jonathan did what he should have done months before. He took evidence to prosecutors and journalists, to anyone who would listen. The story, fraud, falsified reports, and profiteering in a clinic that many had trusted, began to leak. The legal engine turned. Investigations were opened. Meanwhile, the girls continued to withdraw. They ate less, slept less, followed the rooms like ghosts. The State Protective Services took notice when a reporter's lens captured the image of Maria carrying groceries for a house that had barred her from entry, and the story painted a picture of a disgraced nurse infiltrating a wealthy home. It was a cruel spin. Maria was painted as a threat, and the girls were portrayed as endangered. The authorities removed Maria from the house preemptively, citing protective measures. But Maria hadn't been living there legally. She had been a domestic worker, and the machinery of media and power bent towards sensational headlines. The reaction of the girls to Maria's forced absence was immediate and devastating. Sophie and Emma stopped eating, then stopped leaving their beds. They would not speak. Jonathan realized with raw, cold clarity that he had been a pawn in a larger, cruel theater. The momentum of reputation, the authority of a clinician who had weaponized her credentials for profit, and Jonathan's trust in that system, had cost his daughters months of healing. The discovery of the report, though corrected in a court filing later, came too late to rescue those months. But it became the fulcrum of a legal cascade. Evidence gathered by Jonathan's team painted Dr. Hart as a manipulator of diagnoses and financial streams. Testimony mounted, falsified patient files, diverted funds, the manufactured need for long-term invasive treatments. The Medical Licensing Board convened. Investigative reporters traced a scandal that implicated a network of complicit providers. Dr. Hart tried to fight. She hired the best lawyers. But documentation is a kind of light that can't be wholly contained, and the more she fought, the more cracks appeared. In court, under the stark glare of legal scrutiny and camera flashes, the pattern emerged. Dr. Hart had been cultivating a brand of medical authority that she used to steer patients toward services housed within her own empire. She had suppressed benign reports that recommended simple psychosocial approaches, music therapy, consistent caregiving, the kind of human presence she privately scorned as inefficient. In a particularly damning sequence of emails, an assistant at the clinic had typed the words some had been too scared to say aloud: revenue targets and case retention strategies. When the verdict came, it was not the dramatic, headline-grabbing prison sentence that the tabloids later conflated it into. But Dr. Hart's medical license was revoked. She faced civil penalties and was barred from serving on hospital boards. Many of her patients were informed that their previous chronic labels would be reviewed. Clinics refunded fees. Townspeople who had once trusted her leadership were left disentangling their faith from the evidence of misdeeds. Maria's name was cleared in official records. Her professional file was reopened. The internal memo that had been used to blame her was declared improperly handled. The small, concentrated justice felt both enormous and insufficient. All the while, Sophie and Emma's recovery had stalled. The months they lost were part of the damage. There is no undoing time, but they also had windows left to open. Jonathan realized he had to return to the simplest prescription: constancy, music, presence, and an ordinary rhythm of meals and bedtime stories. He invited Maria back before the courts finished their work, because she had become to those girls what Claire had been: a safe, nourishing presence. Maria came in on tentative feet at first, keeping to the edges of the household like someone who feared she would not be welcome. But the girls, twins who knew their hearts, ran to her and wrapped themselves around her calves like vines. What followed was a slow, patient reclamation of life. No experimental machines, no invasive therapies, just music in the mornings, messy play at noon, walks in the park, and long, low conversations at bedtime. Maria made soup the way Claire had, with clumsy attentiveness that felt like reverence. The girls learned to ask for things again. Their first awkward sentences, "We want the blue blanket," came like the first shy buds of spring. They learned the cadence of their names. They sang along, hesitant and then with growing confidence, to the lullabies Maria had once sung in a different language. Sophie went back to school, small backpack bumping at her shoulders. Emma learned to draw faces with eyes that looked alive. Jonathan, who had measured his days by board meetings and quarterly returns, found himself measuring them by the tiny increments of recovery: a laugh at dinner, a spontaneous song, a picture taped to the refrigerator. Jonathan's anger toward Dr. Hart never entirely cooled, but he used it to do something larger than revenge. He established the Pierce Foundation, a non-profit committed to protecting children from exploitative medical practices and promoting evidence-based, humane approaches to pediatric trauma. It funded training for caregivers in the centrality of presence and sensory play. It supported research into child-centered recovery models and offered grants to families who could not afford long-term therapy. Maria, who had regained her license and later took a credential in child development, became the foundation's clinical director in a role more meaningful than she had expected. Years passed, and with the passage came a gentle, insistent healing. Sophie and Emma grew into women whose lives bore the indelible trace of what had happened to them: a softness at the edge of grief balanced by a fierce compassion. At 15, they stood on the modest stage of a foundation event in Chelsea, a place Jonathan had insisted be used for community gatherings rather than press announcements. There were cameras, yes, and the reporters who still liked the human interest image, but there were also faces from neighborhoods and schools, people who had found help through the foundation's grants. Sophie took the microphone with a steadiness that made Jonathan's throat ache. "When I was 5, she said, and her voice was clear, "I lost my mom and I lost my voice. For a while the doctors told us the silence would be permanent. They were wrong. A woman who worked in our house showed us mercy. She gave us time and songs and patience. She helped us find our voices again." Emma, who had dreams of being a child therapist, stepped forward afterwards and spoke about the importance of being seen. Maria sat in the first row, her face wet with quiet tears, and when the girls finished they ran into her arms as they had once run into Jonathan's. The crowd rose, not simply out of theater, but out of recognition for the truth that stitched the story together. The healing of a child often begins with someone who will simply stay. Jonathan watched and understood, finally, that his fortune had never been the sum in his accounts. It had been the presence of voices around a table, the practice of being present for the small redundancies of family. A bowl of soup at 8, the lullaby on a bad night, the steady hand that pushed a bike down the block until the child pedaled on her own. Wealth had bought medical machines and specialists, and money could move mountains of procedure, but it could not substitute the quiet, patient labor of being with another human being in pain. The foundation changed policy and saved families, some from predatory clinics, some from unnecessary medicalization, and its seed was simple: that children heal in the company of people who stay and sing and fold their shirts and tell them stories. Maria became its public face in a way she had never sought. She hosted workshops and wrote a gentle manual for caregivers: Presence as Practice. Sophie studied medicine to work with traumatized children. Emma trained as a counselor. Both credited a woman who had once been branded a menace for stepping into a home and simply being there. On a winter afternoon years after Claire's death, Jonathan sat in the living room, the same room where he had found the girls practicing medicine, and listened to the sound that had been absent for so long. Chatty family noise filled the rooms: laughter, the clatter of dishes, the the murmur of two teenagers arguing over nothing in particular. Maria hummed in the kitchen as she made coffee. Sophie and Emma were planning a small outreach program for the community center. Jonathan felt the familiar ache of memory, the absent figure of the woman who had started the house's silence, but it had softened into a brace of gratitude. He learned, as so many of us must learn, that money can buy a lot of things, but it cannot buy presence. It could, however, buy a stage, a platform, to right a wrong. He had used his resources to uncover a fraud and to build something truthful in its place. And the greatest fortune was, in the end, not the portfolio he managed but the voices that filled his home and the woman who had stepped into their silence and refused to leave. The house on West 86th remained a brownstone of stone and wood and tile. Seasons cycled through its windows. The daughters who had once not spoken grew into women who spoke with purpose. And when the twins hugged Maria in front of a crowded room, Jonathan saw, with a sudden, fierce clarity, what it meant to be rich, not having money but having enough humility to learn that the things we need most, love, patience, a hand held through darkness, cannot be billed on an expense sheet. He closed his eyes and for once didn't try to fix anything. He listened. The sound of the house was whole. Which part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our next emotional stories.